Hello, everyone. Wanted to go over the study questions for C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed. Number one, would you say that Lewis is just depressed? Obviously, that is a matter of broad interpretation on your part. I don't know. Um, Clearly, the way that he's talking, especially in the beginning of this, describing how he feels and his life and his outlook on things in the immediate aftermath of his wife's death, yes, he's definitely depressed. I guess the question is whether he's just depressed, whether he's only depressed. Um, I think I'm thinking of several things. When he talks about how he is not motivated to shave or to wash, and how everything just seems grim in his surroundings. These are, I would say, classical signs of depression. But the reason that I asked you the question is it's that just thing, and I think this might refer back to Gustafson's idea of grief and his attempt to say that grief is not just sorrow, grief is a particular emotion. So I just wanted to get you thinking about that, in terms of this man's real experience of grief, whether it's a particular emotion, a particular experience, or whether it's just a form of sorrow or depression in this case. So that's why I don't know what the answer to the question is. I just wanted you to think about it. Number two, Lewis asked the question, where is God? What is his answer to this question? That God isn't there is his answer to the question. Um, that the bitter irony of his situation is that when he looks back in his life to happy times, God seemed like God, that he was right there with Lewis. But now that you might say he really needs him, he says the door is double locked. The door is slammed shut, and he can't find God in his grief. God doesn't seem to be there. So this begins obviously a very traumatic working out of his relationship with God, and his problems with God, and all sorts of thoughts as a Christian about whether his faith not only is secure. I don't know how seriously he really explores the idea that there is no God, although that is part of it, I think. But I think stronger is, what he really thinks of God is a very important part of this. Um, Sorry, kettle is boiling. It's just the kettle boiling. I have to pause. Thanks. Let's continue. Number three, of his relationship with his wife, Lewis says, we both knew we wanted something besides one another. What was that other thing? Well, their relationship with God. I think that's an incredibly important part of this. Obviously, Lewis's Christianity is perhaps, besides the death of his wife, is the major fact of this book. Um, but if we combine those things, that she was a Christian too, that their relationship was always a relationship, a marriage between two people who were devoted to God. And that is an incredibly important part of the book. Lewis is coming to terms with that. So they both wanted something besides one another. He's basically saying that, it wasn't as if their earthly relationship didn't include a view on the horizon of their being in the afterlife, being with God. That was always, he's reminding himself that was always a part of it, that in a certain sense, there was always a third party in his marriage, and that was God. And he's sort of trying to tell himself that, that she is with God now. That's good, but his grief will not let him feel that way. I mean, that's a big part of the book. Is that that's one of the reasons he feels that he's being selfish. He wants her back. He wants his earthly relationship with her back, seemingly more than he wants her to be with God, and that's a very disturbing thing for him. How does Lewis define death itself on page 6? I think I know the answer to that, but let me make sure and look at page 6 so I don't misinform you. Yeah, here, if you look at page 6, this paragraph here where he says, we both knew this. It's right here. We both knew this. I had my miseries, not hers. She had hers, not mine. The end of hers would be the coming of age of mine. It's pretty. It's a pretty heavy way of putting it. I mean, her death would be the end of her miseries, but to be really the high point of his miseries. We were setting out on different roads. This cold truth, this terrible traffic regulation, you, madam, to the right, you, sir, to the left, is just the beginning of the separation, which is death itself. So the answer to that question, straightforwardly, is he defines death as separation, and that should ring a bell. Meaning that should remind you of another Christian writer that we read for this course, Paul Landsberg, who saw death as the horror of death, the terror and menace of death as a separation, isolation from the community. And that was what was so terrible and threatening about death, is that it threatened to cut us off from the ones we love, from communities. So it's pretty amazing, actually. I think the correspondence there between these two thinkers, who are very different thinkers, but both Christians, obviously. Number 6, Lewis says that he doesn't have a good photograph of his wife. Why is this a matter of concern for him? Well, that's an open-ended question. I mean, it may be self-explanatory, it may seem obvious. Well, when somebody dies, you would like to have a good photograph of them. However, this is more because he mentions that thing about the photograph in conjunction with his fear that he is forgetting her already. That is, not forgetting her entirely, of course, but forgetting what she was really like. This pretty amazing idea that, well, we could skip ahead to question 8, where the simile about the snowflakes, that, if there's a, if there's a statue on your lawn, has certain outlines, but then when the snowflakes fall, they begin to blur. Can't really tell quite the same level of detail. That's like his memory of her. The snowflakes are falling, and his memory of her is getting farther and farther away, inevitably, from what she was really like. Number 7, at the start of chapter 2, Lewis says, for the first time I've looked back and read these notes. They appall me. If I'm not mistaken, that's because he realizes that, for the first time I've looked back and read these notes. They appall me. From the way I've been talking, anyone would think that H's death mattered chiefly for its effect on myself. That is, he realizes that he's being selfish, that in writing about, thinking about the death of his wife, what he seems to be concerned with is how it affects him and not her or her children, his stepchildren. So, yeah, I mean, that it really should be about her, but it's ending up being about him, which I think is really interesting and really indicates something maybe beyond Lewis about grief itself, that in a certain respect, grief is selfish. Grief is selfish because it's our pain. Grief is about our pain, the living. It's not about the dead. The dead don't grieve for themselves. We grieve for the dead. So when being concerned with grief, we're being concerned with ourselves rather than the person who's gone, the person who's died. And there is something, I don't know if it's appalling, like he says, but there is something selfish about that. Number 8, well, we've already talked about number 8 in conjunction with number 6. Number 9, what point is Lewis making in his metaphor of the rope? Well, that's a metaphor for his religious faith, how much faith he really has in God. As he says, you don't really know, you don't really care, let's say, whether a rope will hold until you need it to keep you from falling to your death, right? And he's never really needed, I think, is what he indicated, his religious faith as much as he needs it now. And he's not sure that it is strong enough. Number 10, Lewis asks, in what place is she at the present time? What is the answer to that? Well, the answer to that is she's nowhere, in the sense of the usual presuppositions we have about our earthly life. I mean, to say that she is not anywhere does not indicate that she doesn't exist. But when we think of the afterlife, if we think about the person continuing to exist in some form, it is not their earthly form. They don't have a body that we could say locate in space. Where is she at the present time? In what place is she at the present time? She's not in time or space. A grown-up, mature version of the afterlife forces us to say that the dead, if they continue to exist, certainly aren't in one place and one time like we are now. It just wouldn't make any sense. So the reason I think it's worth dwelling on is that this is a great challenge. I mean, to say, well, the dead do not exist in any one place or time, yet they still exist in some form. Well, that's the problem that goes all the way back to Plato. Like, how can that be, right? So it's an important issue. Number 11, what point is Lewis making through the image of the spheres or globes? That is an incredibly important thing, right? As a Christian, in the earthly life, you're a circle. You're two-dimensional. And yes, his circle intersected with his wife's circle, so they shared this life. But the idea of the Christian is that the afterlife is three-dimensional, a globe or a sphere rather than a two-dimensional circle, indicating a fuller existence, like Landsberg said, self-fulfillment, being with God in a way, and having a form of existence which is infinitely more satisfying, infinitely more fulfilling than the existence we have here. But again, the bitter irony is that he wants his two-dimensional intersection with his wife. That's what he really wants. He's not concentrating on the fact that now she's three-dimensionally in this more fulfilling way with God. He wants that two-dimensional intersection back. That's what he's grieving for. Number 12, does Lewis believe that we meet our dead ones again in the afterlife? Not in any obvious sense, right? No. We don't. We don't get back what we had here. That is for sure, right? We may be part of a more comprehensive communion with all beings through our being with God, but it's not the reunion on the other side that people like to imagine. Again, that's kind of like kid stuff. A more grown-up, mature, clear-sighted view of what an afterlife would entail does not entail some kind of actual meeting. So, yeah, I would say his answer is no, at least not in any obvious sense. Finally, number 13, what kind of fears about the nature of God does Lewis express? Well, that's kind of obvious. So he's afraid that God is bad, or at least not good in any sort of recognizable sense. And I think he gets over this by the end. But he has a lot of complaints about God. And obviously one of those complaints is that his wife suffered so much. She died of cancer. He's known a lot of people who've died of cancer. He will, within a few years, die of cancer. And that's a terrible, horrible, painful way to die. And his fear is that if God could treat his wife so badly or let her suffer so much in her earthly life, what guarantee does he have that suffering will not go on in the afterlife? It's a crazy thought, he recognizes, but it's a definite thought he has. And I think by the end of it, he's gotten over it, but it's a very important part of the book, these doubts and fears about who God really is.